Hi there, it's Neil from Dag and Remove. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different on the channel, and I'm going to take a look at what I consider to be good introductory war games for people who are brand new to wargaming. Perhaps you're interested in it, heard about a few good games, like to try it, don't know where to start. This video is hopefully going to help point you in the right direction. So what do I consider to be a good introductory war game? Well, let me tell you a little story. About 3.5-ish years ago, I began to get interested in historical gaming. It came from that kind of very much strategy Euro based background. And I wanted a game, I began to get more interested into the historical side of things. I wanted a game with more combat, more of a war game theme. And I wanted a game that had simple rules, relatively simple rules at least. The rules were clear and easy to understand, didn't take too long to play, was accessible. I read so many best of lists where the games were 15, 20 years old and are now completely unavailable, or at least they were over here in the UK. I wanted a game with at least reasonable components. You know, I come from that Euro background, and components were, you know, of a certain quality, shall we say, and war games had a reputation for being not quite so good. And I wanted a game that I could also perhaps play solo. And after much research, the game that I chose was At Any Cost, Metz 1870. It's a game which long-time viewers of the channel will know I thoroughly enjoy. It's a great game. Actually, no, I correct that. It's a fantastic game. It's a truly excellent game. Is it a good beginner's game? No, absolutely not. Terrible as an introductory game. It's too long. It's too complicated. The components are of a wargame quality, which if you're just coming to them from that kind of Euro background, you will think, what on earth have I paid my money for? Because they are paper map sheet, printed counters. They work fine. There's a reason why war games are made of those components. But compare them to what you get for your money in other genres, not so much. And at least over here, it's completely unavailable now. So not a great introductory game, although more advanced people definitely check that one out if you can. In fact, the one thing that this game would have going for it is that it's got a very good solo side to it. Well, yeah, you play both sides, but you know, it's pretty good. So what's going to follow now is 5 games that I think are excellent games for beginners into the wargame hobby. And I'm going to look at it. I'm going to try and say why I think they're good and what part of the hobby they're going to get you into, because wargaming has a whole spectrum of different things within it. I'm going to try and look at games that are reasonably easy to pick up in terms of the rules, where the game isn't too long, and that is how long is a piece of string sometimes with war games, where the components, if the component quality is not to that kind of standard of other games, perhaps they are at least distinctive and stand out in some way, and also availability. Games over here in the UK at least are relatively difficult to get hold of, unless you have one or two of the major manufacturers where are quite straightforward. But some of most ball games, there's one, maybe 2 places at most you can get them from, or you order them from abroad, which has its own challenges in 2021. And the other thing I'm going to look at is how suitable are they for solo play. Now, for me, that's very important because I play most of my wargaming solo, and I know a lot of people do the same thing, at least playing both sides solo, even if it's not a dedicated solo bot. So that's what I'm going to do. 5 games, no particular order. They're just 5 games that I would suggest people go out and have a look at. The one other factor I'm going to look at is how expensive are they, because that is a very important factor when you're first getting into a game. You don't want to go and spend £100 or $100 on a game that you hate, or it's far too complicated, whatever. So clarity, ease of accessibility, availability, cost, and components. That's what we'll use, and we'll start now. The first game that I'd recommend is The Shores of Tripoli. It is a game designed by Kevin Bertram and published by Fort Circle Games, during which you will play as either the Americans, who are the blue side, or the Tripolitanians, who are the red and orange side, as they fight the First Barbary War during the earlier days of the American independence. And the Americans are trying to establish trading routes with the older parts of Europe, while defending those trading routes against the Tripolitanians who want to retain control over the region. This is a game that I was slightly hesitant to include on this list for two reasons. First reason is it's one of the very few games I've ever been given by the designer, and I didn't want that to appear to have influenced my decision in any way. And the other reason is, of all the games on this list, despite being the newest, it's also possibly, at the moment at least in the UK, the least available. But in the end I thought, do you know what, it doesn't really matter where I got my copy of the game from, so long as I'm honest and upfront about that. And also, let's hope that this popular game is going to get a second printing sometime soon, because credit where it's due, this game is really well worth checking out for anybody really, but also particularly for newer players. And the reason it's good for newer players is it introduces you to a few concepts that are becoming increasingly common in wargaming. It's set up for the solo mode here, which is why the cards are at the top here. Basically, each player will have a hand of cards, and that's the deck. They'll have a hand of cards, and you'll have both players will have the ability to play cards either for the text-based event on them, in order to carry out the event, or in order to achieve a victory condition, which is what these two cards are, or you can discard cards to move. So it's not a living card game or anything like that. Everything you need is in the box, but it does introduce you to this idea that you manipulate what's on the board by playing and discarding cards. Now, in the American point of view, what you're trying to do is defeat Tripoli militarily, or you are trying to force a peace treaty. However, that's quite different for the Tripolitanians, who are trying to make the cost of the war too much in terms of gold, or you're trying to sink as many of these bigger ships as possible. Or the other way you can win is to defeat the land armies that will eventually appear on the board. And that introduces the new player to the idea of asymmetry, two very different sides with different victory conditions that you achieve through the same mechanism. It's becoming increasingly important, that idea in wargaming. There are lots of games out there, the coin series being a particularly well-known example, where the sides are asymmetric, but you play in much the same way, but you achieve different ends through how you resolve your actions and so on. There have been some commenters, reviews, whatever, that say the game is on rails. Certain things will happen at a certain time, and that's true. To an extent, that's true. For example, at the beginning of the game, if possible, these Corsairs will try and make a run for Tripoli. The American allies here will always disappear around about 1803. And the secret to the game isn't so much reinventing history, it's how you best manage your hand of cards in order to either achieve the historical result or improve on the historical result. And that introduces the new player to a very important concept in wargaming, which is that of wargaming as a simulation. And this is a very playable simulation. Both sides have a broadly equal chance of winning. However, there are plenty of games out there that are simulating a battle, and the sides are often quite unbalanced. So, for example, games set in the Eastern Front of World War II, in and around Russia, the Battle of the Bulge is another one. And when you're coming from a non-wargaming gaming background, where everything is usually balanced, everyone's got an equal chance of winning, even if you're quite asymmetric, when you're recreating and exploring the historical events, as you do often in wargames, you can have that imbalance. And this is a nice introduction to the idea of wargaming as a simulation rather than a pure game, although this one itself is very, very playable. As with many games, and I think most of the games on this list for sure, and a lot of other games as well, the game is crying out for a decent player aid. The rules themselves are not too bad, but the rulebook is very much that two-column view of the rules world, but it's not too bad. And once you get the hang of what you're supposed to do, it's really quite straightforward to play. And a large part of that is because of the abstraction of combat. Many games you will find is, or I find myself anyway, is that combat is often the most complex part of a war game. Once you get used to some of the basics that are common throughout wargaming, the combat is often the most complex part, but this one is abstracted. You roll some dice, 6s are a hit. Okay, so that then is my first suggestion for an introductory war game, The Shores of Tripoli. If there's one game on this list that the new player will have heard of, it's almost certainly this one, and this game is Memoir 44. It is a big box game published by Days of Wonder and designed by Richard Borg. Originally released back in 2004 to coincide with the anniversary of the D-Day landings, some 60 years prior to that. It's a game that is definitely on the wargaming as a game end of the spectrum rather than wargaming as a simulation. It's a game that has terrific components, these double-sided tiles to represent different terrain types. Of course, you do have the plastic miniatures. You know, who doesn't love playing with toy soldiers in that way? You know, you have tanks and artillery, and so on, and you can get a real feel for a large number of wargaming concepts, and there are many paths to take after this game if you begin with this particular game, and that makes this an excellent introductory game, even if it is, by some definitions, definitely more of a game than with a war theme rather than a simulation of historical events, as many war games are. So what we do in the game is you're all playing either as the Germans or the Allies in World War II. It's not long after the D-Day landings or on the D-Day landings themselves, depending on which scenario you're playing. And you play cards to manipulate items on the board, and you have to achieve certain objectives. It's a game that's very much two-player. It's not the easiest game to solo, although you can do it by playing both sides, and it's not the easiest because you do have the hidden information across the other side of the board. The concepts that I introduced you to are many, but some of the more important ones and more applicable to other war games are things such as line of sight. You can't see something if you can't hit something if you can't see it, which is a particularly good example. We have terrain. Each of these different tiles represent a different piece of terrain, and each of those pieces of terrain have a different effect on the board, whether they block line of sight, whether they affect movement or combat. And having just one or two, maybe three of these different pieces of terrain on the board rather than an entire map full is a real good introduction to a terrain effect chart that you would find in many other games. There are different unit types. We've already said about the tanks and the infantry. We do also have artillery, and they move slightly differently. They have slightly different effects in combat, which again is an introduction to the more advanced games where every unit on the board has a different movement range, different combat factors, all of that sort of stuff. Great introduction to that for the new player. Combat itself is very simple. It's a case of rolling some dice, and these are custom dice, and applying the effect. Depending on what you roll, depends on whether you hit something, miss, various other things. And of course, depending on whether you're in a certain amount of terrain, you will add or minus a die from the number of die that you roll. Simple, abstracted combat. Another element that this game introduces to a new player is an element that I think is becoming more common in wargaming, and that is the idea of a game being card assisted. We had card driven in the Shores of Tripoli, where all the action takes place through cards. Here is a game which is quite heavy on the cards in some ways, but it does have more flexibility in what you do with, based on playing those cards than perhaps in Shores of Tripoli, and that's I tend to think of being as card assisted. So, for example, while we do have the odd card that you play for the effect, there are many cards like this one here where you will play the card and then move a number of units stated in a part of the board stated. So, for example, that card I just showed was move one unit in each section, and you have a left, centre and right section of the board, and you move one group of units, or shoot one group of units, or take one action, and that's up to you. So you're less directed than you are in perhaps a card-driven game, and that's increasingly common. It's used in the No Retreat series. It's used in the Platoon Commander series, and there are other examples. And obviously they don't do it quite the same as it does here, but that idea of having cards to support the action or the hex encounter game is definitely becoming more common. And what those cards do is, particularly these cards here, if you don't have the required units in the place that you need them, for example on this card it would be on the left side of the board, you would struggle to use it. And so it brings in the fog of war element of not knowing what's on the other side's hand. It brings in communication difficulties of being able to move the right people in the right places, and it just does bring in many other factors from much more advanced games. The rulebook is very clearly written and very much in the style of a Euro type game. Lots of illustrations, simple points, a few sentences for each point, and that's really helpful because it does illustrate again some of those more advanced concepts that are very common in hex encounter games. Advance after combat, for example, that's in here as well. Retreating is in here. And the other thing it does, and I'm not sure if I mentioned that this on the board at the moment we have the Operation Market Garden, or the A Bridge Too Far scenario, if you like, and that's just one of a multitude of scenarios in here. You have, I think there may be 10 or 12 scenarios, and each one is a slightly different board, and each one is modified based on factors applicable to the historical event. And that is an introduction for the new player of the idea of having a basic rule set that's then modified by the different scenarios. And that is, again, hugely important. There are so many games that do have that element of a basic rule set modified by scenarios. There are entire series based on that concept. And speaking of series, where you can go from here afterwards, in addition to those more card assisted games, you can go to Command and Colours, which is what this game is actually part of that series. Can't comment too much on about that series because I haven't played any of the other games in the series apart from this one. But if you want to kind of lose the cards and be more of a simulation, you do have games like the 44 series or the 4X series. Mark Simonich, Holland 44 would be a much more complex version of this scenario. So all in all then, Memoir 44, fantastic game for beginners. The next game I'd like to highlight is a personal favourite of mine, but I'll readily admit it is probably not going to be so for everyone, and that game is Meltwater. It's a game by Erin Lee Escobedo and published by Holland Steel. It's a game in which players play the Americans in blue there, or the Soviet Union, who are the red side, towards some unspecified point in the Cold War, where the Cold War has become a hot war, the unthinkable has happened, and the world has been laid waste by nuclear weapons. Antarctica here is the sole remaining habitable part of the planet, and despite the radiation creeping ever closer, what remains of mankind is still fighting, even as the world comes to its final final end. So pretty bleak, but an excellent game. And it's a game which is pretty simple. It has many of those war game mechanics we spoke to before, where you move and you have a certain number of actions and so on that you can do. You don't really have anything like zones of control or anything like that in it, but it has those kind of war combat elements, and then they apply those elements to something quite different from many other war games, and it becomes more of a strategy area control type game where the area you're trying to control shrinks ever closer. You have a set of cards up here and you can see where the radiation, which is these little black circles, and the refugees, which are these civilians with the counter there, where they're going to come onto the board, and then where you're also going to come on next turn. And the aim of the game, although you can fight in the game, it is a significant action fighting in the game, the aim of the game really isn't to defeat the enemy in combat, it's to position yourself so that the enemy is stranded in no man's land, surrounded by radiation at the end of a turn, and they either move to a home, back home if they can, they defect, or they die. And that phase is called the starvation phase, which is about as representative of the rest of the game as you can imagine. The game is an example of a war game as an exploration of what if, of what could have happened in the past or what may happen in the future. And there's a whole slew of games that take on this theme, and many of them are very complex. So thinking of a Cold War turned hot type scenario, a game in this kind of what if side of wargaming would be something like Next War, which is very complex. There's a range of games in this series, but they're very complex, much more complex than this. Games in the alternative history with a more of a strategic side to it rather than a military simulation side would be something like Cataclysm, A Second World War, which is an alternative history of the Second World War, which takes again, much more complicated than this, but it has a similar kind of area control, alternative approach to a well-gamed topic. In terms of this game, though, the rules are pretty simple. It's very straightforward to follow. There's only a few phases, but the rules are very much of that 2-column, for very little in the way of illustrations rulebook. That's very, very common in wargaming. But what this game has, and many games have, but what this game does have is a fan-made player aid, and this really does summarise very, very well what is in the rulebook. And that's the side of wargaming that I really wanted to highlight, and this is just a great game to highlight in its own right, but there is a side of wargaming where many of the games are made by small companies who are fans of the genre themselves, and they do the best they can with a niche market with very few sales compared to something like the bigger mass market games that you might see with Memo 44, and the community around the wargaming really supports that by producing player aids and so on and so forth. So it's a really good side to wargaming to highlight with this game. It's not exclusively to this game, but there are many companies out there who produce games that are smaller. This box for Meltwater is much smaller than the others that we showed you earlier, and it's a game that that community is a side of wargaming that really can come together and support a game, and I think that's great personally. And this is just a good example of where you do have that community support behind it. In terms of the components, it is a boxed game, and it's as I was saying in the introduction, there is a certain type of component that's typical in most war games, and that is that the map is made out of paper. The components are simple, mostly cardboard tokens and so on, and because of the small print runs and the very niche market, this small box will cost you almost as much as the two bigger games at the beginning. The first one of which I think was funded through Kickstarter, and the second one is obviously a bigger, closer to a mass market type game from Days of Wonder. But anyway, this game is truly fantastic. You can solo it by playing both sides, and as an introduction to playing both sides to the best of your ability with no real solo mode, you can do that very easily with this game because it is far less complex in terms of the different units and so on than many other games in this what if side of gaming. The other thing about this game, and one that I really like, I do have the retail copy here, and just banged the camera, but I do have the retail copy here, but you can get it print and play. And you obviously would have to supply the components that aren't printable, but you can get it print and play, and that's another side of wargaming which is very accessible compared to buying big box games that are quite hard to get hold of. Print and play is great, and there are more print and play games to come. But anywho, this is Meltwater, a bleak game, but a very, very good one, and highly recommended. Attack of the 50-Foot Colossi, designed by Herman Luttmann and published by Tiny Battle Publishing. The fourth recommendation on this list of recommended introductory games for new players to wargames. This is a game which is a smaller game than the others featured so far. It is a game that actually comes retail, at least, as a folio game in one of these kind of comic book type bags. It's a game that I have here in the version in front of you is actually a print and play game. So this is now me moving into my little niche within a niche within a niche of the hobby gaming world and of print and play war games. I have a whole video about why I love these, but let's look now at just this particular game. And this game is almost the polar opposite in terms of its feel compared to Meltwater, whereas Meltwater was a fairly bleak exploration of what might have been. This is a B-movie in-joke turned into a game. In the game you are playing a Space Marine squad known as the 124th Galactic Marine Raider Battalion, top of my head, and you're fighting in this particular game in the series against some very large rocks called the Colossi, and there are different tribes of rock. There are the Yellowstones, the Brownstones, Whitestones, Greystones, etc. And these rocks are trying to defend their homeland, for want of a better description, and they have come into conflict with the Marine battalions. There's a different reason in each of the three games in this series as to why the alien races have come into conflict with the Marines. They're fairly tenuous, but broadly speaking, it's that 50s B-movie thing. Somebody does something that the other ones don't like. They have a fight in space, all sorts of daft weaponry. It's that kind of a game. But in this particular game, you're going to be moving around shooting these stacks of aliens, and there's between 3 and about 5 in any one stack. And then once you've done your turn, the cards here are going to indicate the order in which the Colossi move, and then they're going to move, they're going to do an attack if possible, and then they're going to do a special action. And this game, as you may have guessed from that brief description there, is a solo game where you control both your own actions and the actions of a game-driven AI bot type thing. And for that reason, this is probably the most complex game on this list, bordering on intermediate level wargaming here, because you do have both your own actions and those of the Colossi. But the reason I wanted to show this as part of this particular series of recommendations is because it introduces players to some things which haven't been shown in the other games on this list, and those things are very important throughout wargaming as a whole. And one of them is the differences in unit types and how you can have quite subtle differences that have different abilities. So here we have a HQ unit, a scout, and a regular marine. Now, if you look, you have these different numbers. There are 2 3s and 4s. They are combat dice and defensive numbers, so they are the combat factors. In many games, they're strength points and defensive points. You have movement, which is that 2 and that 3, but then you have a different type of movement for that individual unit. If I show you a couple of the other counters, we also have sort of heavy weapons guys who roll many more dice, and then we have special operations who have a different weapon entirely. And so that introduces you to this idea that different counters within any one army or any one side can be quite different, and they all have their own little thing, their own little way of moving, their own little rules. And as you progress through wargaming and you get into more complex games, that can be quite a lot of different things going on in any one game. Sticking with just the counters here on the marine side, we do have a disrupted side and a full strength side, and so this is the concept now of step losses, and this is in every intermediate level wargame ever, I think, will have these step losses, and in this particular game they're quite easy to keep track of because there are relatively few counters overall. Another idea that this game brings to the table is the idea of a reinforcements track, where you have, depending on the turn, a certain number of reinforcements coming on at a certain time. And this is most common with historical games where they have an order of battle, as it's known, where certain forces from a particular side join the battle at a certain time, and each turn will represent a certain time. Now, we don't have quite that level of detail here because obviously this is made up, but you do have turn 4 some reinforcements, turn 7 some more reinforcements. In addition to those elements that it introduces, we do have these cards, and this will give you the order in which the AI activates. And for solo wargaming, this is something that is again fairly common, or becoming fairly common, where a card will tell you the order in which the enemy activate and what they do as well. And there's some quite complex systems that eventually become flowcharts of what the enemy forces will do where. And in addition to that, the other thing this game does is chip pull. This is where you take a token from a cup at random, and in this case you draw the event, and then you will perform whatever that event is. And in this game you have a list of different things, and then you apply those effects. In other games that might be an activation order for a certain side, or even for a solo bot. We do have also the terrain, as we mentioned before, in the Memoir 44 game, and that will have different effects for different units, and sometimes in some games it can also have different effects for different types of unit as well. Not so much in this game, with the exception of certain terrain being more hazardous than the marines than it is for the colossi or the living rocks. So tons of stuff in this game that is good for a new player to get into in a way that is fun. I just realised there's another one where we have these status effects. A certain thing can happen to the marine side and they can have a stunned result or a paralysed result. Tons of stuff in here, and this is good for a new player because it introduces it in a way that is fun. And that is so important, I think, even though we've been talking about wargaming as a simulation and as a way of exploring alternative history, what ifs and all the rest of it. At the heart, if you're not having fun playing wargames, you're not going to play them at all. And this game is fun, as are the other games in the series. I said before, this is a B-movie in-joke as a game. We have special weapons are called the boring bit, and it's basically a large drill bit designed to drill into the big rocks. the status effect, which is the equivalent of a stunned, is chipped for the Colossi. The whole thing is just designed to be very silly and very fun. The rules are somewhat similar to previous games that I've shown, where they're very much 2 columns. However, in this case there is somewhat more illustration, which again does help, particularly with the combat and the different effects that different weapons and so on can have. And there are a couple of scenarios in this game as well. The map is actually 2-sided. The other scenario is on the other side of the map. What else about this game? I don't know what else to say about it really, that I haven't already said in other videos. I love this game. It's fantastic. I would recommend it heartily to anyone who's even slightly interested in wargaming. And that game is Attack of the 50-Foot Colossi from Tiny Battle Publishing. And if I show the full box here of my print and play series, I've left a space just in case they ever make us number 4 in the series. The final game that I'd like to highlight on this list of introductory war games is a game called Until the Bitter End, designed and released by Matt White, who's also done the really rather wonderful artwork for the game. The game is released in 2 parts really. There's the first part, which was the British Parachute Regiment, best represented perhaps by this counter here with the famous red beret, and facing off against the Germans somewhere in Europe after the D-Day landings. The second game, which has exactly the same rules, but has far more maps and introduces things like vehicles and so on, and various other bits and bobs in the far right hand corner of the screen there. That is the same game but with the US Airborne. So they're the same game with exactly the same rules, but you just have the US Airborne or the British Parachute Regiment. But why this game is featured in here is because it introduces you to that tactical man-to-man squad level game without the need for minutiae of rules. It plays very, very quickly. It's suitable for a solo player. It's got a dedicated solo bot. The artwork is just fantastic throughout, and we'll look at that a bit more in some detail in a moment. It has a few concepts that we've seen before. It has the chip pull system, where you reach into the cup, pull out a token, and then you activate one of the units. You can move and shoot, various things very similar to some of the actions in other games I've highlighted in this list. But one thing this game does do that the others don't, and another reason why it's on here, other than the fact it's very simple to play and great for a beginner, is it introduces some of the more advanced concepts such as defensive fire. So this counter here has got what in the game is called snap fire, but it's defensive fire. So if an opponent was to move, they would be able to shoot out of sequence. It's also got charging. So for example, if this character here was to move down, you could go into close combat. It's a very simple close combat in this game, but it introduces that idea of acting out of turn and different types of combat, not just shooting. We also have different weaponry, for example the light machine gun here and the Bren gun, which has a different number of shots compared to other games. Combat is simple though. You roll some die, and on a 3+ you hit or wound. And it's just such a simple, straightforward game to play as a beginner. I think I mentioned a bit earlier, it is one of the games that I picked up when I was first playing, and I played it to death, to the point where the map that I was using at the time actually fell apart. I'm in the process of having to remake it. But the original game, which has sort of the basic rules for the 10 counters on each side, is sort of this map here. The second game, the US Airborne game, features many more maps. I think there's 9 in total, and these are just 3 of them. It includes rules for vehicles, for buildings, for things like control, drivers and passengers. It never gets massively complex, but it adds a little bit extra, like foxholes and so on. As well as, of course, the US airborne rather than the British airborne. So the same rule set, and this here you'll probably note as I flip through, this is actually the rule set for the second game. When I get to the cover, and it is the US airborne, and you can see the fantastic art there. It is game 2, but the rules are exactly the same as the original, but without, the original doesn't have the vehicles, for example. Now the solo rules are interesting because this is another concept within Wargames where the solo has a list of priorities to run through. And let me just find the right thing. Yeah, the AI activation. Basically, you run through a list of priorities. So you don't have a set system. There's no flowcharts, no cards to pull. But when you draw a German counter, if you're playing solo, you look through this list of priorities, and depending on which priority is triggered, you then perform an action with the appropriate counter. Now what that means is you do need to have a little bit of self-direction as to how you apply some of those results, and this is something that is used a fair bit, perhaps not as commonly as some other things, but it's certainly a way of playing war games where you have a guideline rather than a strict fixed flow chart or a card determining the action. Now the rules themselves are very simple, it really straightforward, especially if you don't worry so much about the other stuff that comes with the second part of the game and just stick to this first one. Very, very simple. Quite short, so you can get through virtually all the scenarios in under an hour. And this original game, we have 4 scenarios plus an intro scenario for 2 players, plus the same for solo. And the original game does come with an expansion where you can play the German Fallschirmjäger units as well. And something else that the game does is, if this isn't enough in one small box, or actually one small downloadable file, is it introduces the idea of each of these individual characters having their own ability and their own effect. So you can begin to build a more narrative element to the game as well, which of course is used a lot in other solo war games on and off. And you can have the German side and your own Air Force side as well. Now, this game is print and play only, which may seem a little bit of a strange thing to highlight because you can't get it retail. And I got my copy through, there was a Kickstarter for the, there's actually a third game in this series which looks at tanks, but it was actually another game entirely by the same designer. And I got this set finally after several years through that Kickstarter. But the reason I'm including it on here, apart from the fact it's so simple, is because there is on Board Game Geek a free scenario that includes the whole rules for the entire game and a free scenario that you don't find anywhere else. And it's completely free to download from Board Game Geek, or at least it was at the time of filming. And that was the scenario that I played over and over again when I first began to play war games, to the point where the map here with this fantastic artwork actually fell to bits, and I'm in the middle of rebuilding the game. So we have a try before you buy game, which as an introductory game where you're not sure whether you want to play this type of game, whether you're not convinced, you just want to try it out. Try before you buy. Can't really go much further wrong than with that, can you? And of course, at the end of this particular type of game, this man-to-man tactical stuff, you have games like Fields of Fire, the lock and load tactical type stuff. You have games like 65, and of course the Slippery Slope, that is eventually Advanced Squad Leader and games of that nature. So jumping on point for some very complex stuff right here, and you can try it before you buy. and that is the reason this game is here on this list. Super game, really good fun, ticks all the boxes, and there's that free scenario. Okay, that then is the end of this list, and I've ended it on something of a high point with Until the Bitter End. So there you have it, my suggestions for introductory war games out here at the end of 2021. With any luck, this has proved to be a useful video, maybe a little bit informative even about some of the mechanics and where you can possibly go after you've passed that introductory stage in the hobby. But the important thing to remember is there are so many games out there that you can try at all levels of the hobby. I've highlighted 5 that I personally enjoy. However, for every one of those 5 that I've highlighted, there's another 10 that somebody else may suggest in their place. So it's a case of having a look at what's out there and seeing what you think you would enjoy the most, and really just going with it and giving it a go. The important thing to remember when you're playing war games is to just have fun and not worry too much about what level you're playing in terms of tactical or strategic or what have you, and just go out there and try a few different things out. And hopefully this video has given you enough information to be able to do that. With all that said then, I've been Neil from Diagonal Move. If you've liked the video, please click the button, comment in the comments, and subscribe if you haven't already. And hopefully I will see you next time.